Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second lecture from week 4 of History 126, HMR 162, The History of Human Rights in Europe. I, per always, am Professor Adam Zentek, your instructor for this course. Now, in our last two lectures, we reviewed 19th century capitalism and socialism and their relationship to the human rights idea. In general, we saw that those supporters of laissez-faire capitalism were hostile to the idea of positive rights that emerged from the socialist tradition in the early 19th century in Europe. Socialists, for instance, demanded things like workplace protections, fair wages, the right to vote, women's emancipation and equality, basic rights we now associate with the human rights idea and with modern democracies. Now, so far in this class, we have investigated the idea of human rights and its history, primarily as a philosophical project related to the Enlightenment and to the French Revolution. And we've traced the language of rights from the mid-17th century up until the late 19th. But there is another separate motor for human rights in the 19th century, and that is the development of international humanitarian law, according to the principles of just war theory, which is to say, the ethical set of principles that guide the use of force in war, and the laws that are attempting to formalize these ethical and moral principles. These laws, the laws that govern the use of force, are called international humanitarian law. I know it sounds, when you say international humanitarian law, or IHL, it sounds like you're talking about human rights law, but you're not. You're talking about, it's also known as, the laws of armed conflict. So international humanitarian law is distinct from international human rights law. So our subject of the next few lectures in this class will feature war and its consequences. And today what we will focus on is the concept of just war theory, which again is a set of ethical principles developed to guide the conduct of war. We will trace just war theory from its roots in early Christian Rome through the 19th century in Europe, when interstate wars became so destructive of life and property that ethical boundaries on the use of force were adopted to minimize the amount of suffering that comes with war. Now, as we will see, just war theory essentially divides into three components. There is, on the one hand, jus ad bellum, which is the justice of the war. There is, on the other hand, jus in bello, which is a Latin term that means the justice in the war or during the war. And then on the other hand, there is jus post bellum, the justice of the peace. We'll consider the first two principles, which is to say jus ad bellum and jus in bello, today, describing both their classical formulation in Christian thought and the philosopher and ethicist Michael Walzer's modern revisions thereof. Just war theory, I want to argue now and throughout the rest of this course, is perhaps the single most important part of our modern human rights regime. For all its flaws, just war theory and international humanitarian law, its formalization in international law, has probably protected more people from more violence than any other single legal system in history. We'll continue to investigate the development of early international humanitarian law with a particular focus on three things: the founding of the Red Cross, the first international human rights organization, the 1864 Geneva Conventions, which had to do with the treatment of prisoners of war and the sick and the wounded on battlefields, and the 1899 Hague Conventions, which sought to determine or limit what types of weapons could be used on the battlefield. And our key terms for today: first, jus in bello. Second, Henri Dunant. Henri Dunant, as we will see, was the founder of the Red Cross. And Hague Law. In general, when international lawyers refer to Hague Law, they are talking about body of law, of international law, that governs what kinds of weapons can be used on the battlefield. and our framing questions. First, what are the basic principles of just war theory, and from where did they come? Second, does international humanitarian law actually do anything? Is it robust enough to guide or determine behavior on the battlefield? Okay, so let's get started with the meat of the lecture. And our central topic again will be just war theory, a set of ethical rules and moral standards that are designed to minimize the suffering that inevitably comes with war. Now, just war theory is essentially based on two different assumptions. First is that war is evil. It's evil for two reasons. It's evil first because it leads to unnecessary suffering for innocent people who are forced to kill and die to protect their communities and their ways of life. Encounters with violence, particularly the mass violence of war, challenge our sense of who we are and our deepest moral convictions. It challenges our idea, our conception of what is right and good. The second assumption is that war is inevitable. It's unreasonable to expect that states at any time soon will stop using force in international relations. And so it's best to recognize this reality and try to mitigate the consequences. Now, the point of just war theory, once again, is to reduce or minimize the suffering that comes with war by establishing a set of criteria that explain when it is appropriate or just to go to war and how to fight justly during the war. With just here doing a lot of work, the word just here suggests a limitation of violence to the absolute minimum. Just war theory has its origins in the thinking of the Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo, who, in his work, The City of God, attempted to reconcile some of the Christian principles of pacifism with the bloody reality of Roman politics, which were often violent and warlike. Now, Augustine wrote in the early 5th century, about a century after the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and thus made the empire effectively a Christian one. After the pagan Visigoths invaded and sacked Rome in 410 AD, a traumatic event for the Romans, it was clear that both Rome and Christianity would have to fight to survive. Rome, after all, was an empire built on military might. But then how do you square the necessity of war with the Christian injunction to do no harm, right? That thou shalt not kill. The key for Augustine lay in distinguishing between killing outside of war, which he considered to be murder, and killing during war, which he considered to be not. Now, Augustine essentially argued that Christians are allowed to kill during a war if certain conditions are met. The gist of his argument is that it is permissible to use violence only to prevent a great sin from being committed, when it is certain that the sin would be committed without intervention, and when the intervention is done in conformity with the just requirements of the sovereign, and when it is done with the goal, the intent, of establishing a just peace. In other words, Christians are permitted to go to war to defend Christianity if a Christian sovereign calls them to do it, and if their goal is not conquest or glory, but establishing a just peace afterwards. Augustine's great theological successor, St. Thomas of Aquinas, went further than Augustine in coding the principles of just war theory in his enormous work, the Summa Theologica, which was written over the course of about 10 years between 1265 and 1274. In order for a war to be just, three things are necessary. First, the authority of the sovereign, by whose command the war is to be raised. For it is not the business of a private individual to declare war. It is the sovereign's business to have recourse to the sword of war in defending the common weal against external enemies. Secondly, a just cause is required, namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Third, it is necessary that the belligerent should have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. Three things then, three standards in classical Christian just war theory: lawful authority, just cause, and right intent. Say it again: lawful authority, just cause, and right intent. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, during and particularly after the Vietnam War, there was a rediscovery of just war theory. Basically, just war theory was ignored up until the 1960s, and a modernization of its principles. Just war theory is now taught in basically every international law class and every military academy throughout the West. Now, modern just war theory essentially has two components. The first are a set of moral norms regarding the use of force. And the second are the set of legal rules and international institutions that are designed to enforce those moral norms. Which is to say, just war theory has this philosophical component, a set of ethical principles and moral valuations, and these are translated, or at least they are attempted to be translated, into a set of legal rules and political institutions which can enforce them. Modern just war theory distinguishes between the justice of the war, justice in the war, and justice of the peace. In Latin, these are jus ad bellum, justice of the war, jus in bello, justice in or during the war, and jus post bellum, which is justice of the peace. Each of these three concepts consists of its own set of rules and standards, and each of the three are logically distinct. For instance, it is possible to fight an unjust war justly and establish a just peace. It is possible to fight a just war unjustly and establish an unjust peace. It is possible to fight an unjust war unjustly and establish an unjust peace, right? In other words, again, these three principles are logically distinct. The point is that why people fight, which is again jus ad bellum, and how people fight, which is again jus in bello, are two different sets of moral questions. Now, the philosopher and ethicist Michael Walzer, in his influential work from the 1970s called Just and Unjust Wars, provides the key overview of modern just war theory. And so it is to his argument, which is part of your reading this week, to which we will now turn. So let us begin with the concept of jus ad bellum, the justice of the war. Jus ad bellum questions revolve around when it is appropriate and just to use force against others, about what makes it appropriate to go to war at all. Now, Walzer argues that the international system, its stability, is essentially based on one principle, which is mutual and reciprocal respect for the political independence and territorial integrity of states. States have borders, in other words, and the people within these borders form a political community with a certain way of life, culturally distinct from those on the other side of the border. Now, for Walzer, every political community that exists has a right to exist by virtue of its existence. And from this right stems another right, which is the right to self-defense. So states are permitted, according to Walzer, to use force to protect their territorial integrity and political sovereignty against external aggression. Self-defense in response to aggression, Walzer argues, is the only permissible reason for recourse to force. It's the only permissible reason to go to war, given a couple of conditions. In effect, the core argument, the center of just war theory, is the idea that the defense of the rights experienced in one political community is the only time that community can legitimately use force against another. The aggressor forces the aggrieved to fight to protect their system of rights and their way of life. This is what makes aggression unjust and criminal. But the right to self-defense is not absolute in Walzer's thinking or in just war theory. There are conditions to make the use of force just. First, and perhaps most importantly, recourse to force must be in response to an actual armed attack, right? An armed attack of sufficient gravity, scope, and scale. Fear of an attack, or fear of a rival's growing power, fear that a rival might attack you sometime in the future, is never a sufficient cause for war, according to the principles of jus ad bellum. So wars that look to the future, in which one party seeks to fight another party now when they're weak rather than later when they may be strong, are no different from wars of outright conquest and aggression. Now, Walzer does allow for a narrow exception here, in the case of what he calls anticipatory self-defense. And there's a very high standard for this exception. Anticipatory self-defense involves one state preemptively striking another in order to prevent or blunt an imminent attack. But the attack really must be imminent, right? Like the missiles are on their way, or the jets are being fueled up on the tarmac. Second, even just wars of self-defense must follow the rule of proportionality. This means that the amount of force brought to bear on the enemy must not be excessive. Right, so for instance, a border skirmish cannot be a pretext for a nuclear strike. Third, the use of force must be the last resort, which is to say all other peaceful and diplomatic solutions have to be unavailable. Everything has to be exhausted before force can be used justly. Fourth, force can only be used justly when there is a reasonable chance of success. States do not have the right to sacrifice their citizens in unwinnable wars, even unwinnable wars of self-defense. Finally, fifth, recourse to force may be countenanced in some extreme circumstances when the policies of one state are effectively a war against mankind. In Walzer's words, humanitarian intervention is permissible, which is to say the use of force to intervene in the domestic policies of another state, when it is a response with a reasonable expectation of success to acts that shock the moral conscience of mankind, like, for instance, ethnic cleansing or genocide. The old-fashioned language, Walzer writes, seems to me exactly right. Now, this is an extremely high standard to meet for the simple reason that mankind is not easily shocked. Later, we'll discuss this doctrine in a little more detail and its formalization as what is called the right or responsibility to protect, or R2P. So taken together, these precepts, which again are self-defense, proportionality, last resort, and expectation of success, make it harder to go to war. Right? That's the point, to make it harder to go to war. The way they work is by circumscribing the political aims for which violence might be used legitimately, effectively negating or reducing entire categories of explanations that would justify war, thereby making wars less likely and fewer. In other words, these principles of jus ad bellum essentially tie the sovereign's and the military's hands by limiting the kinds of arguments that can be made in favor of war, at least legitimately. The rules and standards that govern conduct in war, which is to say the jus in bello principles, serve a similar function, to reduce the scope of the violence of war to the greatest degree possible. At the heart of jus in bello are the principles of what Walzer calls the War Convention, which holds, first, that soldiers are permitted to kill one another on the battlefield without it being considered murder. And second, that non-combatants are not permitted to kill on the battlefield, or to be killed. It is, Walzer argues, the moral equality of soldiers on the battlefield that distinguishes combat from domestic crime. It's what distinguishes killing on the battlefield from murder. Thus, the primary principle of jus in bello, right, the thing that everything else revolves around, is the principle of non-combatant immunity. In general, non-combatants, which is to say people who are not directly involved in the fighting, cannot be targeted, at least not justly. The reason for this should be plain, right? That non-combatants do not represent a military threat, and do not seek to harm the enemy's soldiers. They have not taken a weapon, they have not put on a uniform, and for these reasons they can neither kill nor be killed. A corollary principle is the principle of military necessity. Now, the violence of war, can be justly directed only at targets whose destruction is necessary to bring about the war's end and set the stage for a just peace. This means, for instance, that industries necessary for the war effort, like munitions factories, for example, may be specifically targeted. But civilian industries that only incidentally benefit the war effort, but are primarily civilian in nature, things like electrical grids, agricultural fields, these are off limits. Moreover, even destroying enemies' war material and soldiers, killing soldiers, can be unjust if the violence does not serve to directly advance the war efforts and set the stage for a just peace. Just to say, the violence of war can't be anarchistic, right? It needs to be focused and subordinated to the goal. Another very important principle in jus in bello is that of risk acceptance. That soldiers are obligated to take on risks to themselves, to their life and limb, in order to assure that non-combatants are not hurt or placed in the line of fire. When soldiers are not willing to take on risk to themselves, then a moral hazard results. The fourth principle of jus in bello is that reasonable measures should always be taken to protect non-combatants. It is inevitable during war that non-combatants will be put in harm's way. They'll be caught up in the fighting and the churn, whether by accident or by design. Soldiers, according to just war theory, are required to do everything reasonable to avoid killing non-combatants. A fifth principle is the principle of proportionality. The level of destruction, particularly in terms of the kinds of weapon systems used, must be a function of the value of the target. It's not permissible, for instance, to carpet bomb sites, even military sites, that could be destroyed or taken offline without carpet bombing them. And the final principle is the acceptance of surrender. Once a soldier lays down his arms and is placed hors de combat, either because he is captured or because he surrenders, he reverts to being a non-combatant. A prisoner of war, in other words, effectively renounces his privilege, that privilege to kill on the battlefield, and in so doing gains the protections of a non-combatant, meaning he cannot be abused, injured, he can't be put on trial, and he must be repatriated to his home country upon the war's conclusion. Now, this does not mean that non-combatants can never be killed within the jus in bello framework. There is what Walser calls the rule of double effect. The rule of double effect holds that if a belligerent's intent is to destroy a purely military target, and he meets all the other standards, right? Risk acceptance, reasonable measures to protect non-combatants, and the like, but that there are incidental non-combatant casualties, right? Non-combatants are killed in the course of the operation. These casualties are morally permissible, so long as the other conditions are met and the value of the military target outweighs the moral cost of killing innocent people, which is a very difficult calculus to make. As long as the intent is not to kill the non-combatants, but is rather to destroy, say, the factory in which the workers work, then killing these non-combatants can be permissible in certain circumstances. We can see how this works with two quick historical examples. So we can consider first the Schweinfurt raid, when American B-17 bombers attempted to destroy a German ball bearing factory deep in German territory during a daylight raid, a daring daylight raid. The idea was that ball bearings were necessary for the functioning of the German war economy, for the mechanized elements of the German military. And so by destroying this ball bearing factory, it would essentially be taking offline like all of Germany's tanks and aircraft. So the bombers flew high and fast, but during the day, so that they could target this factory with precision. At least that was the idea. The precision targeting was done so that American bombers would not hit up-built civilian areas and kill non-combatants. Now, doing this was extremely risky, flying during the day. So the Americans in this bombing run met the conditions, at least they believed, for necessity, reasonable measures, risk acceptance, and proportionality. Yet they killed 203 German non-combatants during the bombing operation, who worked at the Schweinfurt plant. Now the question is killing these 203 Germans justifiable? And according to just war theory, it is. Those people should be considered non-combatants whose deaths were incidental and morally acceptable because they were not the target and because the bombers met all the other conditions. In any case, if you know anything about the raid, it was an abject failure and it did nothing to advance the war effort anyway. Okay, the second example, which comes from the 1991 Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein, the brutal and murderous dictator of Iraq, feared an American decapitation strike from the air, which means he feared being blown up. And so to protect himself, he routinely held meetings, hung out in, even slept in primary schools and in hospitals, places with many non-combatants who could be used as human shields. Now, the US military elected not to pursue a decapitation strike, precisely for the reason that if it were to do so, it would kill innocent women, children, elderly, and sick people. Killing Saddam, the argument went, was not militarily necessary to win the war. And the evil produced from killing, hundreds of children at a school would outweigh the benefit, the good produced by killing Saddam Hussein. And so the American Air Force did not strike. So now I'd like to move on to the second half of this lecture. Now that we've discussed what jus ad bellum and jus in bello are and their conditions and characteristics, we're going to look at how just war theory became formalized and embedded in a set of international laws and institutions. And to start, we're going to talk about this guy, Henri Dunant. Henri Dunant was born in 1828 in Geneva, Switzerland, into a relatively wealthy family. And he had been interested from young adulthood in various reformist causes, yet had a successful career as a businessman to boot. He was wealthy. In June of 1859, in the midst of the Second Italian War of Independence, a minor conflict to be sure, that pitted the Piedmontese and their French allies against the Austrians, with the Austrians having essentially dominated northern Italy for a few hundred years. Now, the war ended in an Italian-French victory that unified northern Italy into one independent country and drove the Austrians out of what used to be one of their spheres of influence. Now, this war, the Second War of Italian Independence, was incredibly short. It consisted of only two battles, essentially. The Battle of Magenta on June 4th, 1859, and the Battle of Solferino, about 3 weeks later on June 28th. Solferino was the decisive battle of this war, a French victory that put the Austrians to flight and set the stage for the unification of northern Italy. Now, the battle was neither particularly large nor particularly bloody, at least by 20th century standards. It saw about 100,000 French soldiers fight around 120,000 Austrians. The French took about 17,000 casualties, with about 1,600 killed. The Austrians took about 22,000 casualties, with about 2,400 killed. But the battle was bloody enough and horrible enough to make a strong impression on Henri Dunant, who arrived at the battlefield the day after the fighting. He was essentially a battlefield tourist. He came to see what the aftermath of a battle would look like. Dunant, as you will see from the reading that I assigned this week, was horrified about what he saw in the aftermath of the battle. Eviscerated bodies, pools of blood, injured, screaming, dying men. The experience gave him his life's mission, which was to form an international organization that would provide humanitarian aid to those injured in war, both civilian and combatant. It would take on the name the Red Cross. So, and in any case, soon after he visited this battlefield and had this profound emotional experience, Dunant penned a narrative of the Battle of Solferino, titled, appropriately, Memory of Solferino, whose main argument that something like the Red Cross, just such an international organization, was necessary. Now, the Memory of Solferino contains 3 parts. It begins with a narrative of the battle. Then it contains a description of the injured and dying, of the battle's aftermath. And the 3rd part contains a proposal for this international organization, which would come to be called the Red Cross. So let's consider these 3 parts in turn. Now, Dunant's narrative of the battle is essentially a classic of what military historians call traditional battle history. In traditional battle history, all soldiers are heroes, literally dying to close on their enemies with the bayonet. Officers selflessly sacrifice themselves for their men and for glory. Streamers stream brightly over the field, and men follow orders. The Guard, Dunant says, behaves with noble courage, the light infantry with bravery and daring. Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, who's there at the battle, is quick and brilliant, as is his head commander, Patrice de MacMahon, who's actually quite bad. Now, what you have to realize is this traditional battle history is just a bald-faced lie. This is not at all what battle is like. Battle is the arena of fear and tension. Men kill only hesitantly. They're scared of the violence of battle. They frequently disobey orders. They frequently run away in terror. Battle is disjointed. It's confusing. It's not orderly and rational. Men almost never actually cross bayonets. And most casualties come not from the fighting, but when one side retreats and is shot or sabred in the back. This is why the Austrians have so many more casualties than the French. It's because they run away and then they are defenseless. So in the traditional battle narrative, the French victory is glorious. The Austrians too fight with honor and courage. Everyone is a manly man. But at the same time, there is in Dunant's battle narrative a lot of scenes of death, horror, and destruction. Soldiers are crushed by horses and wagons as they lie dying on the battlefield, screaming for help. Officers are brutally decapitated by cannon, or soldiers see their arms or legs blown off or amputated. The battlefield, he writes, is a, quote, immense field of slaughter, covered with the viscera of men and horses. This focus on pain, on the bodily suffering of the soldier, on his cries of fear and anguish, this part is not part of the traditional battle narrative, which is intended to, the traditional ones, to awe the reader with these tales of heroism and sacrifice, and the brilliance of troops under fire. Right? The purpose of the traditional battle narrative is not to tell us the truth about the horror and confusion of war. And so what we see in this section, at least in part, is something similar to what we saw in the history of Mary Prince, which is the rhetorical use of sympathy to frame an argument about human rights. The point is that we are to imagine ourselves with Dunant, or to imagine ourselves even being one of these battles' sorry victims. Now, the second section, which takes up the bulk of the narrative, concerns itself with the immediate aftermath of the battle, and Dunant actually witnessed this firsthand. The only real way to describe the conditions that the injured endured for several days, until a real medical evacuation system could be improvised, the only way to describe it is harrowing and disgusting. Dunant describes men laying on the ground, their chests or brains openly exposed to the elements for days at a time. He describes limbs that are amputated with grisly, unsanitary tools, and of course without any anesthetic. He describes men dying on the battlefield out of thirst or exposure or simple lack of attention. He engages not only our sense of sight, but our senses of hearing and smell. Oh, the agony and suffering of those days, the 25th, 26th, and 27th of June, he wrote. Wounds were infected by the heat and dust, by the shortage of water and lack of proper care, and grew more painful. Foul exhalations contaminated the air. Indeed, Dunant goes on, as you will see, for pages and pages, describing bodies that were ripped apart, men screaming for their mothers, and their loneliness and death. Dunant does this strategically, so that the reader can see what he saw with his own eyes and relive this horrible experience. Dunant's wager, his bet, is that helping others to see what he saw in the most kind of visceral way possible will cause the same emotional shift that it caused in him. Hence the arguably embarrassing excess of grisly details. How much suffering could have been avoided, Dunant asked his readers, if there were ready a trained body of volunteers awaiting the end of the battle so that they could provide aid and comfort to the wounded? How many people might have been saved, or at least had their final agonies in the presence of a sympathetic medic? How many families would not have received the bad news of a loved one's death? In Dunant's own words, "But why have I told of all these scenes of pain and distress, and perhaps aroused painful emotions in my readers? Why have I lingered with seeming complacency over lamentable pictures, tracing their deaths with what may appear desperate fidelity? It is a natural question. Perhaps I might answer it by another. Would it not be possible, in times of peace and quiet, to form relief societies for the purpose of having care given to the wounded in wartime by zealous, devoted, and thoroughly qualified volunteers? This is the seed of the Red Cross." War isn't going anywhere, Dunant continued. The hopes and aspirations of the Society of the Friends of Peace must be abandoned, he wrote. And since, quote, new and terrible methods of destruction are invented daily, war will likely only grow more terrible, more full of suffering and pain in the near future. In view of this, Dunant wrote, why could not advantage be taken in a time of relative calm and quiet to investigate and try to solve a question of such immense and worldwide importance from both the humane and the Christian standpoint? So, in other words, he was asking how to reduce the scope of the violence and suffering that comes inevitably with war. That every country should have just such an organization to take care of its wounded during and after battle. One that would train, but remain primarily inactive in peacetime and mobilized during war. This was Dunant's idea. It is such a simple, such a cheap, and such a straightforward process to set up and fund such organizations, he argued, and they would do such untold good that they needed to be formed. When we see young fellows disabled, Dunant asked rhetorically, as he was wont to do, with a leg or an arm gone, returning sadly to their homes, must not this give rise to remorse and regret that we have made no attempt to prevent such fatal consequences, resulting from wounds which could have been cured by effective aid sent and given in time? Dunant's argument rests essentially on two suppositions. The first is that no person ought to suffer without reason, even soldiers on the battlefield, for suffering itself is by definition an absolute evil. From this comes the second supposition, which is that those who have the capacity to relieve suffering are morally obligated to do so, even if it means relieving the suffering of our enemies, injured enemy soldiers. We know, in other words, that war means suffering, and we know that we have the power to relieve some of this suffering without much inconvenience to ourselves. Therefore, we are morally required to do this. And so Dunant proposed that a major international treaty be drafted and signed by the major powers of Europe, committing themselves to forming just such an organization. A memory of Solferino made Henri Dunant into something of an international human rights celebrity, at least for a few years. And at an 1863 international conference in Geneva that he led, the groundwork was laid for this international organization. And the next year, 16 nations signed the Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded armies in the field, the First Geneva Convention. This was in 1864. So by 1864, 1865 then, there was an international organization, now calling itself the Red Cross, and a treaty that codified in international law the treatment of wounded and injured soldiers. So this law then, the 1864 Geneva Convention, which is also known as the First Geneva Convention, is a short and relatively straightforward document that seeks to legally codify some of the principles of jus in bello. The treaty, which was signed at first by 12 European states, is short enough, consists of only 10 articles, that we can consider it now in some detail. Consider, for instance, Article 1, which reads, "Ambulances and military hospitals shall be recognized as neutral, and as such protected and respected by the belligerents as long as they accommodate wounded and sick. Neutrality shall end if the said ambulances or hospitals should be held by a military force." In other words, those who are sick and injured are considered hors de combat and regain their non-combatant status. The places where they congregate or are brought, hospitals, ambulances, and the like that serve them, cannot be targeted. And so these sick and injured soldiers lose the privilege to kill, but gain the privilege not to be killed. Article 2. Hospital and ambulance personnel, including the quartermaster staff, the medical, administrative, and transport services, and the chaplains, shall have the benefit of the same neutrality when on duty, and while there remain any wounded to be brought in or assisted. So medical personnel as well cannot be targeted, at least not legally. The idea, obviously, is to allow them to relieve the suffering of the injured. And Article 3. The persons designated in the preceding article, meaning Article 2, even after enemy occupation, continue to discharge their functions in the hospital or ambulance with which they serve, or may withdraw to rejoin the units to which they belong. Which is to say, even if their side has lost the battle, medics must be able to continue to treat their soldiers unmolested. And so together, Articles 1 through 3 create a special protected class of person on the battlefield, the neutral medical worker. I would argue that Article 6, though, is the most important one in the document. It reads, "Wounded or sick combatants, to whatever nation they may belong, shall be collected and cared for. Commanders-in-chief may hand over immediately to the enemy outposts enemy combatants wounded during an engagement, when circumstances allow and subject to the agreement of both parties. Those who, after recovery, are recognized as being unfit for further service shall be repatriated. The others may likewise be sent back on the condition that they shall not again, for the duration of the hostilities, take up arms. Evacuation parties and the personnel conducting them shall be considered as absolutely neutral." Which is to say, injured soldiers ought to be repatriated to their home countries, so long as they promise, pinky swear, to not again take up arms. Armies, in other words, don't have the right to abuse or imprison indefinitely those people, enemy soldiers, they pick up on the battlefield, for the simple reason that being an enemy soldier is not criminal. Soldiers, in other words, share moral equality on the battlefield. Merely fighting in a war, even fighting in an unjust war, is not, according to the principles of just war theory or international law, itself a punishable offense. The rest of the articles are kind of boring, so we're going to skip them. As you can see, the 1864 Geneva Convention was quite a modest start. It had nothing to say, for instance, about proportionality, about non-combatant immunity, risk acceptance, etc. It was purely focused on protecting the wounded and the people who served them. Yet, as we will see, Geneva law will expand dramatically in the middle of the 20th century. It now comes to 4 long and comprehensive treaties, along with 2 additional protocols, the treaties from 48 and 49, the protocols from the late 1970s. So finally, I want to move on to what legal historians and lawyers, international lawyers, typically refer to as Hague Law, which is the body of law that regulates the means of force on the battlefield. It emerges slightly later at the end of the 19th century, the 1890s, and then the first decade of the 1900s. For instance, the first Hague Conference took place in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in 1899 and produced an international treaty. The second Hague Conference took place in 1907 and added relatively little to the proceedings of the first. So I want to look at this 1899 treaty briefly and discuss it in terms of just war theory. This treaty is much longer and more complex than the 1864 Geneva Conventions, so we can't go into a bunch of detail. It consists of 4 parts. The first part is called the Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes. The second is called the Convention with respect to the laws and customs of war on land. The third is called the Convention for the Adaptation to Marine Warfare, the principles of the Geneva Convention of 22 August 1864. And the fourth is declarations prohibiting the use of certain kinds of weapons. So I want to look quickly at Section 1, the annex to Section 2, Section 4, and then provide some questions for you to think about over the weekend. So Section 1 of the 1899 Hague Treaty outlines the creation and structure of an international court of arbitration that would be headquartered in The Hague, in the Netherlands. This court would be empowered to arbitrate between 2 states that had a dispute and guide them to a peaceful resolution of that dispute. The idea was to effectively prohibit the use of force in international relations by providing a forum allowing for the peaceful resolution of disputes. This was a noble idea, one that derived directly from the principles of jus ad bellum, to wit, that states do not have a sovereign authority to wage war on one another, to violate one another's political independence and territorial sovereignty. This was a noble idea, and one directly derived from jus ad bellum principles, that principle that states only have the right to go to war in self-defense, to protect their territorial integrity and political sovereignty. And only once all peaceful avenues had been exhausted. So the idea of this International Court of Arbitration is to provide a new, robust forum for the resolution of disputes. The court never really did anything, right? It didn't do very much to stop the outbreak of the First World War, for instance, but it still exists. Section 2 is important for our purposes. It does a whole bunch of things. It defines what a lawful belligerent is, which is to say who's allowed to kill on the battlefield. It outlines the treatment of prisoners of war. It provides standards that limit the use of force in a conflict. And it outlines how military occupation and the treatment of sick and injured soldiers ought to work. Now, Article 1 defines who could be considered a legal belligerent, and thus gain the legal privilege to kill on the battlefield without it being classified as murder. These are still the legal standards that are in place today. So Article 1 of Section 2 reads, "The laws, rights, and duties of war apply not only to armies, but also to militia and volunteer corps, fulfilling the following conditions. To be commanded by a person responsible for his subordinates, which is to say to have a clear chain of command. To have fixed distinctive emblems, recognizable at a distance, which is to say, to have a uniform that identifies you as a soldier. To carry arms openly, and to conduct their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war." It continues, "In countries where militia or volunteer corps constitute the army, or form part of it, they are included under the denomination army." So this applies also during guerrilla wars, small wars, civil wars. In other words, combatants who dress the part, respect the chain of command, carry their arms openly, get a host of rights that regulate their humane treatment if they are injured or captured on the battlefield. Many of these rights are listed in Article 23 of Section 2 of the 1999 Hague Convention. It reads, "Besides the prohibitions provided by special conventions, it is especially prohibited to employ poison or poisoned arms, to kill or wound treacherously individuals belonging to the hostile nation or army, to kill or wound an enemy who, having laid down arms or having no longer the means of defense, has surrendered at discretion, to declare that no quarter will be given, and to employ arms, projectiles, or material of a nature to cause superfluous injury, to make improper use of a flag of truce, the national flag, or military ensigns and enemy uniforms, as well as the distinctive badges of the Geneva Conventions. And finally, to destroy or seize the enemy's property, unless such destruction or seizure be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. In other words, armies are not permitted to simply slaughter enemy soldiers, particularly once the enemy has been defeated. Once men surrender and are placed hors de combat, they cannot be abused or killed, precisely because they no longer represent a military threat. This is a legal codification of some of the core principles of just war theory. Okay, so moving on to section 4, which contains 3 subsections, and this will close out our discussion of the treaty. Subsection 1 is titled Declaration Concerning the Discharge of Projectiles and Explosives from Balloons or by any new analogous methods. It is pretty short and to the point. It reads, the contracting powers agree to prohibit, for a term of 5 years, the launching of projectiles and explosives from balloons or by any new methods of a similar nature. The article thus prohibited aerial bombardment of any type and by whatever means. The reasoning is that this new technology would allow for the targeting of civilians behind the lines, and this would tempt belligerents to attack civilians unjustly to hasten the war's end. The idea was to make this illegal. In the event when the First World War began, and all the belligerents did this, even more so in the Second World War, it revealed that this particular part of the treaty was rather toothless and naive. Subsection 2 is titled Declaration on the Use of Projectiles, the object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. It too is pretty short and to the point. It simply bans the use of chemical weapons. It reads, the contracting powers agree to abstain from the use of projectiles, the object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. Now, the reasoning here is, of course, twofold. First, chemical weapons themselves, by their very nature, were thought to be inhumane, because they caused much more suffering than was necessary. Second, chemical weapons could be used to target non-combatants with devastating effects. Think here of the use of poisonous gas during the Syrian Civil War. The final subsection, subsection 3, is a mouthful. It's titled, The Declaration Concerning the Prohibition of the Use of Bullets which can easily expand or change their form inside the human body, such as bullets with a hard covering which does not completely cover the core or containing indentations. It reads, the contracting parties agree to abstain from the use of bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body, such as bullets with a hard envelope, which does not entirely cover the core or is pierced with incisions. The article banned, in other words, what we typically call dum-dum bullets, bullets that flatten and expand and tumble when they hit the human body, which cause grievous and untreatable wounds. Right? Exit wounds from a dum-dum bullet are like the size of your fist. These bullets, the reasoning went, caused unnecessary suffering on the battlefield, and therefore could not be used justly and ought to be illegal, and in fact became illegal. So all this leads to the big questions that I want you to think about, which is so what? So what? Do these laws actually do anything? Does just war theory matter? On the one hand, we could turn to the history of warfare in the 20th century, subject of our lectures next week, and the week after, and see that basically none of the laws from the Hague Conventions and very few of the laws from the 1864 Geneva Conventions were followed, particularly, of course, by the German army in both world wars, which readily killed civilians when it felt that would benefit it. All the belligerents in both wars sought to use air power, particularly from 1916 forward, to attack enemy civilians behind the lines. Indeed, the only thing that stopped the First World War from becoming a complete disaster for non-combatants was the trench system itself, which ironically protected these non-combatants precisely because it fixed the fighting geographically. On the other hand, just war theory has provided a robust, powerful language that the belligerents used to accuse one another of criminal behavior, that they used to drive popular opinion about the war through propaganda in their own countries. Consider, for instance, the famous story of the crucified Canadian. In this rumor, which was not true, German soldiers nailed a suffering and injured Canadian soldier to a tree in no man's land, essentially crucifying him, leaving him to die. Now, this story supposedly embodied the evil of the Hun or the Boche, or Jerry, who had no respect for the laws of war, no respect for human morality, and thus needed to be not only defeated but punished severely. The moral outrage, then, that belligerents felt towards one another was expressed in the language of just war theory and international humanitarian law, which has, it must be admitted, great moral power. This is the language that gave meaning to the conflict, for better or for worse. And we can look even today in the case of the wars in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. The language that is being used to describe these wars, right, is the language of just war theory, that the strikes are not proportional, that civilian non-combatants are being targeted, that hospitals and ambulances have been blown up, right? All these things have their roots in this 19th century in Europe, these concepts that you shouldn't blow up ambulances. And the way we talk about war today is basically through the lens of just war theory, or at least the way that we critique war. Now, there are, of course, critics of the laws of armed conflict, like the Secretary of Defense, who usually base their arguments on one of three assertions. The first assertion is that the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, just war theory, these things are bad because they tie the hands of the warfighters and make it harder for the warfighters to find and kill their enemies. But this is not really a criticism at all, if we keep in mind that the point of these laws is to do exactly that, to tie the hands of warfighters, to make sure they can't use certain kinds of weapons or target certain kinds of people, even if it would benefit them, simply because it's unjust. It shouldn't matter that soldiers sometimes chafe under the restrictions of international humanitarian law. It shouldn't matter that they feel hemmed in by the laws of armed conflict, because the laws don't exist only to protect them, right? The laws exist to protect people from them. The second assertion is that the laws of armed conflict make wars longer because, again, they tie the hands of warfighters. Now, this seems to me to be a historically ignorant argument. It simply doesn't accord with the historical evidence. Ignoring or abandoning the laws of war has not helped states win wars in the 20th century. If anything, abandoning the laws of war has made it harder for them to win. A great example here is, of course, Nazi Germany. That's not to say Nazi Germany lost the Second World War because it didn't follow international humanitarian law. It is to say that not following international humanitarian law did not provide the Nazi Germans with some crucial tactical or operational edge on the battlefield. It didn't help them. And the final critique is that IHL is violated so often, it is functionally useless. This, I think, is very stupid and doesn't understand the basic nature of the law. Right? Laws are only required when people violate them. It is unnecessary to criminalize something that nobody does. Right? There are laws against murder, for instance. Murders still happen. But I've never heard anybody say, somebody got murdered, there should be no laws against murder. Indeed, one of the effects of the existence of international humanitarian law and the language of just war theory is that it allows us to condemn the acts of war in morally persuasive and powerful terms. Just because people violate IHL doesn't mean that IHL ought not to exist.